This PowerPoint will cover contemporary sonnets that we're discussing in this unit. These sonnets are based in theory on the same format that the sonnets were based on during the Renaissance period, so I highly recommend going back and reviewing the sonnet PowerPoint that I shared with you during that time. Many of these sonnets, because they're being written in a contemporary setting, do not exactly follow the rules of the sonnets that you read before, but they will toy and play with those rules. And you'll see that more and more as they get more and more contemporary. The first sonnet that you have is called Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. Robert Hayden was a famous poet during the Harlem Renaissance, and he was good friends with many of the writers from that period, including Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison. So we're going to read through this poem together, and then we'll talk about how it resembles a sonnet and why we include it in this category. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Okay, so you have here 3 stanzas, and they don't resemble the traditional stanzas that we would expect to see in a sonnet. So usually in a sonnet you would expect to see 3 quatrains and a couplet, or you would expect to see an octave, an 8-line stanza, and then a sestet, a 6-line stanza. We don't have any of that. We have a 5-line stanza, that's called a cinquain, then a quatrain, the 4 lines, and then another cinquain. So it doesn't resemble, in terms of stanzas, anything like a sonnet. It also doesn't have a rhyme scheme. So you have early cold, ached, made, him. Nothing rhymes here. So again, sort of dissimilar to what you would expect to see from a sonnet. So why did I include this poem in your sonnet section? First of all, you'll notice that it has 14 lines. So that's the basic rule for a sonnet, is that it has to be 14 lines long. The other rule for sonnets that's important is the volta. And if you remember, the volta is the moment when a sonnet changes from call to response. So in a traditional Shakespearean sonnet, you might have 3 quatrains that all asked a question or presented a scenario. And then you'd have a couplet that answered the question or responded to the scenario. So I want you to notice these last 2 lines are separate from the rest of the poem. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So we actually do have a volta between the bulk of the poem and then that question there at the end. What is this shift? What is this volta? This poem is a poem of looking backwards. So the speaker is clearly grown up now, but he's looking back on a moment when he was young and thinking about what that felt like. And he's thinking about all of a sudden these vivid memories of his father waking up early before everyone else and kind of doing this thankless work. So even on Sundays, the father would get up and with his hands that were tired from his job, he would still do this work at home. He would make the fire so that nobody had to wake up in a cold house. But notice this tone of regret. Nobody thanked him, right? And now the boy is remembering that he would wake up and hear the father get up, and he thought, you know, I didn't want to get out of bed because the house had chronic angers, he said, so maybe it wasn't necessarily a happy home. But still, there was this father who was doing this service for everyone in the house. And so I sense in this poem a great regret. And so we have this memory of the young boy's experience. And the boy remembers that he never said thank you to his father. And I get the sense that now it's kind of too late. The poem doesn't say that. I just kind of feel that when I read it. And then we have this question at the end. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Austere means like plain or undecorated. So if you think about love as having like spaces to live in or to work in, offices that are plain and ugly and lonely and boring and, you know, difficult, that's really what love is, isn't it? So love isn't chocolates and flowers. Love is getting up before your family does so that they can wake up in a warm house. And so, again, the boy is kind of, the man now is saying, you know, what did I know then? And there's the suggestion, of course, that he knows now I know now how much my father loved me and what that means. So we do have the 14 lines and a little volta there before these 2 lines at the end that kind of ask a question after this premise or scenario has been laid out. Next we have a lighter poem. This is by Ted Kooser, and this poem is a little bit more of a traditional sonnet. So as we read through, I want you to notice the rhyming patterns. At dinner, in that careful rouge of light, or 5 or 6 martinis, you could pass for Ginger Rogers. We could dance all night on tiny tabletops as slick as glass in flying shiny shoes. As Fred Astaire, my wrinkles grow distinguished as we dine. My bald spot festers with the growth of hair. I grow intelligent about the wine. But such high life is taxing. Urgencies excuse us from the table. Hand in hand we seek the restrooms, trembling at the knees, and find our grins grown horrid in that land of flare-lit, glaring mirrors. Through the wall you flush your toilet like a lonely call. Okay, so first of all, I want you to notice the rhyming pattern. We have A, B, light pass, night glass. Then again, C, D, Astaire, dine, hair, wine. Then we have urgencies, hand, knees, land. So another EF rhyming pattern. And then finally we end with the couplet, wall, call. So even though the lines aren't broken into separate stanzas, we have the rhyming pattern here of an English or Shakespearean sonnet. And so I want you to notice some things about this sonnet. So this is a funny one. It's sort of darkly funny. So this is an anniversary, and we can guess that it's probably a later anniversary, like maybe 20 or 30 years, because the couple is a bit older. He has a bald spot and wrinkles, etc. But at the beginning, we have the scenario. At dinner in the right lighting and after a few drinks, you could pass for Ginger Rogers. So Ginger Rogers was kind of a sex symbol. She was a great dancer. She's a movie star. And Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire were a famous kind of dancing movie star couple. So he says, after a few drinks and the right light, you look just like Ginger Rogers. And we could dance all night. And I'd be just like Fred Astaire. And he says, my wrinkles are growing distinguished. Like the longer we eat, the more attractive I must look. My bald spot is starting to grow hair again. I grow intelligent about the wine. So the more they drink, the smarter and more attractive they appear to each other. Here's our volta. We get this but. So up until this point, everything's been getting more and more fun. We're drinking, we're having fun. You look like Ginger Rogers. I'm Fred Astaire. I'm not bald anymore. But then we get the intrusion of reality. Such high life is taxing. Urgencies excuse us from the table. So the urgencies here is the fact that they have to pee because they've been drinking, right? So they go to the restrooms, and then when they look in the mirrors under those he says flare-lit glaring mirrors, you can imagine that artificial light shining above them. They see what they really look like. And he says that we find our grins grown horrid. Through the wall you flush your toilet like a lonely call. So ultimately the thrill is gone, and this anniversary, while it started out nicely, has kind of been ruined by reality. Finally, I gave you another kind of darkly funny sonnet called This Be the Verse by Phillip Larkin. You can see just by looking at it that you have 3 quatrains, which is very similar to a Shakespearean sonnet, but he does not include a couplet. And so as we look in terms of the poem's content, we might understand why he leaves off the little resolution at the end. So as we read this again, look at the rhyming pattern. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. Okay, so the theme here of this poem is not to keep on going with this pattern of pain where we mess up our children, and so possibly that's why there's no kind of finishing couplet here. So he's saying, let's just stop. Let's not go forward with this. And so let's not finish the poem even. Let's just cut it off right now. So the exclusion of the couplet may be significant in that way. But ultimately, the poem is probably sort of self-explanatory. So ultimately, it begins by saying, your mom and dad, They mess you up even if they don't mean to. So partly they can't help it. They're filling you with their own fault. So the things that were never perfect about your parents probably get handed down to you. And then they come up with some new crazy stuff to do to you that is, not as unique to them. But then we get some sympathy for them, and we're kind of starting to look backward a little bit. So they mess you up. Who messed them up? Well, their parents did. He describes your parents' parents as the fools in old-style hats and coats who were half the time they were drunk and the other half of the time they were fighting, right? So your parents can't help it because their parents did it to them. So the first stanza starts with you. The second stanza kind of zooms out to your parents' parents. The third stanza kind of looks at the entire human race. So we've zoomed out completely. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. So if you can picture the coastal shelf, it starts out with the beach, which as the water greets the beach, it kind of the land starts to sink down. And if you could see under the water, slowly but surely, the land just kind of falls off into the abyss. So Larkin is saying that's kind of how the misery is that we pass on to each other. It keeps on getting deeper and bigger. And he says there's one solution, which is to basically die as soon as possible and not to have any children. So yes, it's a dark poem, but ultimately it's kind of funny. The language kind of keeps itself light, and the rhyming pattern is hard to take seriously. So it is a dark poem, but it also has kind of a sing-song quality, so it's hard to stay too downtrodden, and ultimately I kind of chuckle when I read this one. So I hope you enjoyed these modern takes on the sonnet. Again, all of them depart a little bit from the traditional sonnets that we read during the Renaissance. And if you're interested in those differences, that could be an interesting paper topic. Let me know if you have any questions.